John Koski's book on the Confederate battle flag, that could stay, but the Confederate flag onesie, which we had, yeah, had to go. The real question is, why did we have that stuff to begin with? But the public response to that, at least from a portion of the public, was, oh, you're removing the Confederate flag now. You're taking the Confederate flag from these battlefield spaces. That then translated into, they're not flying the Confederate battle flag at Gettysburg anymore. We never flown the Confederate battle flag at Gettysburg. But that was the reaction. That was the issue that we had to navigate as far as our public relations.
And the strange thing is, I remember that onesie was an adult size.
Addressing Gettysburg.
All right, good afternoon. Jill Iron Fist Titus has given me the okay to start now that it is past 3:15, so thank you, Jill. As I was starting to say, we have a nice variety of individuals from a range of institutions, public history institutions here today, to give us hopefully an enriching, diverse perspective on some of the best practices of doing public history, particularly in this current moment in which we find ourselves. Before we get started, I would just like to briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios, of course, are listed in your programs. But to start off on my immediate right with Nicole Moore. Nicole Moore is a public historian and consultant with over a decade of museum experience, much of it focusing on interpreting the lives of the enslaved. She holds an MA in history from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and currently serves as the Director of Education at the National Center for Civil Rights in Atlanta, Georgia. To her right is Chris Gwinn. Probably a name and face familiar to many of you. He is the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at Gettysburg National Military Park and a 10-year veteran of the National Park Service. Chris is also a 2006 graduate of Gettysburg College, and he holds a master's degree in public history. Chris has been a wonderful friend and supporter, not only of CWI, but also of Gettysburg College and its students over the years since he's graduated. We have taken advantage of his time, perhaps entirely too much, over the years, but he is such a gem to have just up the road from us, and we're very grateful for him. To his right is Bryan Cheeseboro. Bryan is a park ranger at the Civil War Defenses of Washington, which is a unit of the National Park Service. Bryan is also a reenactor with Company B, 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, and a former board member of the Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses of Washington. To his right is Kevin Levin, and many of you, I think, are probably readers of Kevin's blog, Civil War Memory. Kevin is a historian and educator based in Boston. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the Civil War, including Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's Most Persistent Myth, and Interpreting the Civil War at Museums and Historic Sites. Kevin's Civil War Memory Substack, previously a blog, excuse me, Kevin, Substack, not a blog, has been a major platform for doing history in public for many years. And finally, not last but not least, to his right we have Matt Callery, and some of you might be more familiar with Matt's voice than you are with his face, because you might be loyal listeners of Addressing Gettysburg. Matt Callery is the host of the popular Addressing Gettysburg podcast, which uses the Battle of Gettysburg as a springboard to explore the military, cultural, political, economic, and societal aspects of mid-19th century America. Matt has also been a wonderful friend and supporter of CWI over the years, a wonderful marketer as well for what we do here at CWI, so we thank you for always helping to promote us and support our programming. So when Pete and I had originally sat down about a year ago to start planning the conference for CWI 2025, we were committed to offering a panel discussion on interpreting Civil War history for the public. After his untimely passing, not long after that conversation took place, we knew we had to make this panel discussion a reality. As you all know, Pete's passion for bringing history to the public in engaging, critical, and accessible ways was one of his great joys in life. a joy that paralleled his enthusiasm for the classroom. However, never in the conversation that we envisioned a year ago did we anticipate the realities of the current state of the public history field, where unprecedented cuts to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the removal of entire pages of educational text from the websites run by various federal agencies, an executive order calling for the censorship and reporting of park rangers whose interpretations, quote, inappropriately disparage Americans past or living and do not focus on the greatness of the achievements and progress of the American people, as well as a budget bill that could essentially gut the National Park Service, one of the nation's most treasured guardians of our cultural and natural resources, looms forebodingly over Congress. As a historian, I am admittedly wary of referring to anything as unprecedented. And while indeed our nation's historic crown jewels have faced myriad threats and Spartan times before, these particular times in which we find ourselves do feel rather unprecedented. This is largely due to the enormous regression they threaten to impose upon decades and decades of hard work by those most dedicated to the progression of quality historical research and interpretation. Now, we are all here today because we care. We care deeply about history and historic sites, about the wide swath of stories and diverse voices that have shaped our past and our present. And though some of us might very well differ in our opinions about politics and process, I think it's safe to say that we are united by our shared passion for learning about and stewarding the richly complex history of our nation. And so while we have to acknowledge the current and enormous elephant in the room, so to speak, we must not let ourselves, in our understandable outpourings of passion, fear, outrage, sorrow, lose sight of the broader topic of just how it is that we best do Civil War history in public, as well as the intellectual sophistication, critical inquiry, and thoughtful approach that this practice deserves. Part of that approach is not letting ourselves forget the big picture of public history as a field, its roots and its evolution, and the best practices to which we collectively must recommit ourselves daily in whatever manner we can. Sometimes we will have the ability to fully implement our visions for those best practices. Other times we may find ourselves more restrained. And to that end, we do have, of course, two federal MPS employees here in our panel today, Chris and Bryan, who are in a bit of a different position than the rest of us in this discussion. We just have to acknowledge that. And I first want to extend our sincere gratitude to you both for joining us today amidst the uncertainty of these trying times. Secondly, I just want to remind our audience that we must respect the framework in which, especially these two individuals, can discuss certain topics or certain questions posed to the panel today. So to help us start off with some perspective on the roots and evolution of public history itself, we first need to acknowledge that public history has always been inherently political. When Anne Pamela Cunningham and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association famously stepped forward to preserve George Washington's home in 1853, they did so, yes, to spotlight the life of our nation's first president and founding father, but also to enshrine in our national narrative a sense of patriotism rooted in the political and moral righteousness of elite white male leadership. Formed in the crosshairs of the sectional tensions that define the 1850s, the MVLA was also a conscious attempt to provide an example of national leadership that both North and South could and did draw inspiration from, while also not so subtly celebrating Washington's proud Virginia roots. When William Appleton proudly formed the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, formerly known as SPINIA, now called Historic New England, in 1910, the support for his organization grew not just out of a concern for the crumbling of beautiful architectural masterpieces from the colonial period, but also from deeply seated anxieties about the significant wave of immigrants pouring into the country during that time, and fears that white middle-class morals and society upon which the country prided itself might be eroded by those foreigners. Hence the embrace of a preservation movement to save the monuments and symbols of a true domestic Americana, New England's iconic old homes. Perhaps most notable was the birth of the official profession of public history in the 1970s, which emerged directly out of widespread societal concerns over the needs and representation of underrepresented groups, African Americans, women, Latinos, the LGBTQ community, the poor, and others whose stories suddenly became forefront in the new social history. This new social history was presented in the classroom and explored for the first time on the very streets and landmarks where that history occurred. And you can see some of the historic sites that became preserved or put on the National Register and began to be interpreted as a result of that movement. In 1995, contested meetings about the past famously erupted in the Enola Gay controversy at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. These ideological battles, now referred to as the so-called culture wars, were forged, on the one hand, out of post-Vietnam era scholars and citizens whose war weariness checked previous notions of a more widely shared, unadulterated patriotism rooted in beliefs of American exceptionalism. And on the other, a cohort of proud veterans in concert with conservative politicians in Washington, D.C. Impassioned debates about the accurate, historic, and respectful way to tell the story of the Enola Gay in its full World War II context spilled through the halls of the Smithsonian and Congress and out onto the streets of our nation's capital alike. Whoops. I didn't capture my last slide. But even in the much anticipated opening of the 2011 9/11 Memorial at Ground Zero in New York City, the politics of a still raw and grieving nation, pleading for stories largely about national unification, the strength of the human spirit, and renewed patriotism in the face of foreign evil, still heavily dominate the museum's interpretation of that fateful day and its larger meaning for Americans. Public history has always and inherently been political, infusing new political concerns and debates from contemporary society into its interpretation, and thus always changing and revising over the years. As a result, public history sites are often contested sites, sites of contested meaning, memory, and interpretation. So with that brings me to my first question for our panelists. My first question to you all is, Civil War history, in particular, for the public, has always been contested. From the early battlefield revisits and writings of veterans to mark regimental positions, to monument dedication speeches, and the creation of national parks at Civil War sites. But why has it become so much more charged and controversial within the last 10 to 15 years?
Okay. I will go first. For me, this answer, or this question, is kind of personal. It starts the trajectory of my career as a public historian doing living history. I really kick-started during the sesquicentennial. This was a moment of where the narrative had expanded. It changed. And so you have this focal point put on other voices. We were lifting up those who were enslaved, who were free and fought for the emancipation of others. We were hearing these narratives, and we were leaning into what then becomes Reconstruction. It's kind of spicy if all you've grown up hearing about the Civil War, or generals and battles in the military, to suddenly have this social aspect. To me, that was exciting. I want to know about the people. No disrespect to my military historian friends. As a military kid, I don't care about that. That was my life growing up. I'm good. I wanted to know about the people. But when you shake a narrative so hard after so long, it gets people a little off guard and a little bit in their own feelings of, well, that's not what we're here for. That's not what we're here to do. But for me, that push against that push on the change of what was happening with Civil War history and how we talked about it 10 to 15 years ago was because we took it away from the battlefields and we took it away from the generals, and we really put it on, that war wasn't just happening on fields. It was happening in neighborhoods and homes. It was tearing families apart, and we looked at the people. And when we started to look at the people, we had to start asking ourselves kind of tough questions and looking at those around us and really interrogating, what would that history be like for me? And how comfortable or uncomfortable does that make me when I think honestly of the ramifications of that question?
First off, I don't know if I'm a military historian or I don't know what I am, but I'm happy to be here. I agree with what Nicole said. And I think back to a time not terribly long ago when you would go to your average battlefield park, be it Antietam or Shiloh or Gettysburg, and there was nothing there that addressed the causation of the war. It was about the battle. It was about the troop movements, and there's nothing wrong with that. I find that incredibly interesting. But you were getting a very limited story there. And so, sometimes I think back to the old visitor center at Gettysburg that I'm sure many of you remember before the one in 2008 opened up. And I worked 3 or 4 years in that building, and I sometimes describe it, and if you've heard this before, forgive me, but I sometimes describe it as it was like going into your grandma's attic. It was really dark. There's all kinds of stuff in there. It didn't really have any order. And that's kind of the way that the museum experience at Gettysburg was prior to the new museum, prior to holding the high ground, prior to this real push to inject causation into our battlefield parks. Now, that narrative at Gettysburg, it changes when the new museum opens up. I would like to think we had always been doing that in the field with our programming, but it didn't necessarily manifest itself in that space. Because again, you could go into that old building and you could read every exhibit on the wall and you wouldn't know why the Civil War was being fought. You wouldn't know what was at stake. I mean, you might not even know who won the Battle of Gettysburg. And so when that narrative in 2008 and 2009 changes and becomes more complicated, and if you've been to the new museum and visitor center, I mean, the second you walk into the museum exhibit, you're confronted very clearly with not only the cost, the human cost of the war, but also what the war is about at a basic fundamental level, which is obviously human enslavement. There's going to be a reaction to that, I think. There's going to be pushback to that from individuals who I think previously saw those battlefield parks as different spaces. I don't want to be delicate with how I say that, but I've certainly seen that shift here in my time at Gettysburg, and I think it coincides with this complicating of the narrative at battlefield parks.
Well, thank you, Chris, and let me say, visiting the visitor center at Gettysburg, it's just absolutely done great. It's amazing. Definitely a good changeover in the way things were before. Well, so to answer the question, I just, what I have on this is that some of the emotionally charged and controversial, you say about the last 10 or 15 years, has been there, I think, really kind of all along.
Yes.
But what I think has happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that it's all kind of met at what I call this intersection of social media. I think a lot of us are learning things that other people have always felt that maybe we had no idea about. And another thing is that when you mention about being a historian, and really anyone, because of social media, anyone can be a historian. But let me also say, because of social media, anyone can also be a doctor, an auto mechanic, a plumber, or whatever. And anyway, but it's amazing that so many beliefs and mythologies we have about a lot of things, because of social media, get this traction, that people really buy into them. And also, just the last thing I want to say is it's interesting that people who fell asleep in history class and history but get their history from unfounded websites and social media memes and Hollywood movies, because we know that they're absolutely true, right? Yes. Anyway.
Yeah, unfortunately or fortunately, Bryan just stole my thunder with that response, because he's absolutely right. It's interesting because if you compare the sesquicentennial with the centennial, I think it's safe to say that most Americans consumed some aspect of the centennial through various events put on by any number of institutions, organizations. But when it comes to the sesquicentennial, by 2011, you do have a vibrant social media, and so you're able to become, well, as Bryan said, your own historian. And of course, as we all know, there are no walls, there are no authorities online. So everything is democratized, if you will, and it becomes a matter of can you find a clever way of gaining the most likes or retweets or whatever you have. But let's also not underestimate the fact that we think about the sesquicentennial as falling between 2011 and 2015, but it never really ended. In fact, one could make the argument that the sesquicentennial actually started, or the period in which Americans are really paying attention to issues related to Civil War memory starts in 2015 with the horrific murders of 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina. We've all seen those photographs of Dylan Roof waving the Confederate flag. And that moment, the revelation of those images and the publication of those images really did sort of set us off on the course that I think helps us begin to understand why we're dealing with the kind of intensity when it comes to this very public debate about the Civil War era. I think it helps us understand why things seem to be much more intense than at points in the past. Although I think, real fast, as Chris alluded to, it's really sometimes hard to imagine that roughly 20 years ago we were having really serious, bitter debates. I remember this because I started blogging 20 years ago in November of 2005. The biggest controversy was whether or not we should be talking about emancipation and slavery at Civil War sites. And there were symposia, there were all kinds of events about whether or not to do this and to go down this road. And these were pretty intense debates. I remember it well. And so there's a lot of continuity. That's certainly the case. And there's also a lot of change.
I agree. The only thing I could add to that is that the question is, but why has it become so much, more charged and controversial in the last 10 to 15 years? I don't know. I think we have always been a hot-headed, polarized country. And it seems that way because maybe it's a little more charged up than it was in the previous 10 to 15 years of our lives. And it seems, social media definitely amplifies everything. I mean, geez, social media, you look at social media, I think there's somebody's going to steal a kid behind every tree, everything is amplified. And so it's very hard to get a real view of the world through social media, which is why I love what I do, because I talk to people. And I talk to these historians here. I haven't had Bryan or Nicole on, but I hope to soon. But I've had Chris and Kevin on, and I really enjoy our conversations. And the audience, I talk to the audience. I hear from the audience, and I talk to them. And sometimes they'll come to town, and they'll take me to dinner or out for a beer, which is great. And but we also talk while we're drinking and eating. And we discuss all of this stuff. And the one thing, and this is, I could probably give this answer for any one of these questions, is that I sense a politicization fatigue in the public. And that's why when we have our shows or we have events or something like that in person, we have one rule: no modern politics, because we're here to study the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, you can't separate the two, for sure. There's a relation, of course, but we find what I love is when we have an event and I look around and I see people sitting at a table eating and laughing, and I know their politics because I follow them on Facebook, right? And I know they're at complete opposite ends of the spectrum, and they probably know it too, but they first got to know each other through our common interest. And then if they want to fight, then let them fight later on and everything. So I think that we are because of social media, more than anything, we are way more polarized, way more charged up as individuals, as groups, or whatever. And it makes it seem like everything is overcharged. And it's, I think we're all, now we're not getting a proper view of things, I think, because of social media. I hate it. It's terrible.
Can I respond to Matt?
It helps us all. What'd you say?
Well, I mean, what I would say is I think that, and I want to give you a compliment because I think you have a very disarming way with people. Where I've watched your show, I've been on it a few times.
Say this more closer to the microphone so everybody can hear it.
For PCN and C-SPAN in the back, addressing Gettysburg. No, you do tackle, I think, topics that are significant in their political connections, their contested nature. But I think the nature of what you do, which is a very conversational thing, I think helps disarm people. And I think some interpreters and some public historians have ways of doing that. So I'll give you an example. There's Professor Scott Hancock and myself. We occasionally lead battlefield walks together, and the walks are basically Pickett's Charge in reverse, where we start on the Union side and we walk back to Seminary Ridge. And we really talk about how the memory of Pickett's Charge has been molded and shaped and in some cases twisted over time. And what I've learned is when you market something with the word Pickett's Charge in it and people attend, sometimes they're expecting something a little bit different than what Scott and I were offering up. And you know, by and large, I think by and large, most people, when you're face-to-face with them, and you can have a conversation with them, I think that's where you can make real progress, when you can have a respectful civil conversation. I think social media is a terrible, terrible space for that, more often than not. But you know, Dr. Hancock has an excellent way of, like Matt, disarming people and being able to talk about these heavily contested things in a way that's accessible but also approachable.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I'll just jump in and say, Nicole, I think you got us off very soundly in the right direction, because I think definitely the 150th was where you got to see the feathers starting to be ruffled. Although I will reiterate what Chris says. I'm former National Park Service myself. I worked the entire sesquicentennial in Richmond with Richmond National Battlefield Park. And by and large, the public was hungry for it. They were all down with hearing about emancipation, about United States colored troops, about women, about the civilian experience. Of course, we got our few hotheads in there. There will always be some. But by and large, most people were down. And then I've got to say, you know, what Kevin brought up with the horrific shooting in South Carolina, that's where I saw, at least working front line at that point with the Park Service, that's where I saw it was like a gunpowder shot. You know, that ignited a whole new series of conversations about Confederate memory, about monumentation, about modern day politics, and how much we draw apples to apples comparisons between the past and the present, between the Confederates and modern day conservatives, things like that. And that's where it got really heated, and that's only continued down the road. So to kind of continue this conversation with my follow-up question, you know, Matt's talking about how people start to experience political fatigue when talking about history sometimes. Not everyone, some people love it, but some people do. So how do we make history usable and relatable without making irresponsible historical comparisons between past and present, and while acknowledging the complexities and contingencies of the time period that we live in?
I could do that.
Yeah.
I could try at least. You have to be, okay, here's what I do. I forget my biases. I try to be honest with myself and with the subject. I don't like being played a fool, and I don't like being played a fool by myself. And to me, if I believe whatever I believe politically, and I let that color my exploration of the past, whatever past, who's ever past, I'm doing a disservice to everybody, myself, the subject, the audience, whoever. I want to get to the truth of things, and in order to do that, I have to be honest, and I have to look at things that might challenge what I used to think or what I think in the moment. I have to look and see, or does it line up with what I used to think? Whatever. But I have to be open to hearing all sides of a story, no matter how repugnant I might find some of those sides. I want to understand what they thought and why they did what they did. And I have nothing to do with this. I'm learning from them so that I don't do what they did or what they thought or whatever. So to me, you have to be honest, and you have to strip away your own biases just for a moment so that you can get to, and I do an hour-and-a-half show with somebody, so I could do that for an hour and a half, But what I've found is a lot of my views on the way the world is and the world works have completely gone away prior to doing this show, because I've learned from people who I would have normally thought were completely opposite of me, and they have nothing to offer me. And then I realized, you know what? That's not the way to be. Like, the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so you got to be willing to go to the middle.
Well, I think I'll just interject again real quick and then turn it back to the rest of you. Again, what Chris brought up about the disarming way that you approach some of these topics, that you humanize the past and you try to relate human stories, and who can't relate to human feelings and human emotions.
Well, that's
right?
So, not to insult the teachers in the room, but I used to say, history is not boring, your teachers were. And then a bunch of my listeners who were teachers got upset, and I took it away, and now it's just history is not boring. Funnily enough, some guy on Instagram picked it up and now uses it, and he's got way more followers than I do. But, so I might be using it again. But the point of that expression is it's the way it was always presented to us that makes people think history is boring. History is the story of people, and we're people. And if you're telling me that history is boring, then you're telling me that you're boring, and your life isn't going to be interesting to somebody one day, and I don't think that's true. I think if somebody found your diary after you die, they may be like, well, who the hell knew that Grandpa was so interesting? He used to just sit there and smoke his pipe and watch baseball. But no, there's something to this guy. And so to me, it's not boring. It's the story of people. It's the human story. So you have to humanize it, because for the Civil War, for example, we've had 150 years of how much soot put on that painting of that story, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm that art restorer with the Q-tip and the solvent on it. I'm trying to get all that soot away so I could see the actual color of that painting. And we talk about putting our politics on things today, but previous generations have done the same thing to it. And so we've got to sift through all that stuff. It's a lot of work.
I'll say I'm always a proponent of I can show you better than I can tell you.
Yeah.
And this is where you start pulling out sources.
Yep.
These letters, these diaries, these news articles, the speeches, they tell you everything you need to know. It's up to us to think about it and say, okay, can I contextualize this in a modern lens so that I have a greater understanding? Yes. Does that mean that they are one and the same? No. Will you find similarities? Yes. What can we glean from that? And that is not me telling somebody that. That's the document speaking. That is me putting them back in that moment with those people, getting that human feeling and realizing, oh, they really said that. Yes, they did. How do you feel about that? How does that sit with your spirit? And then allowing people to get that critical analysis and start to really think, okay, well then how does that have an impact to today? How does that tie into how A, B, and C works for us? That's what we do. And I don't have to be the one to tell you. All I have to do is show you. I'm a guide. As a historian, it is my job to make it interesting, to make the history a little sexy. But I don't even have to do that using my own words. All I got to do is say, if you just read this page, and this page, you will find a whole hot mess right here. Have fun with that. And when we allow that to happen, we allow our audiences, we allow those that we are trying to educate to see history how we see it, through that critical analysis of documents and sources put in place by those who really didn't think we were going to be all up in their business And I'm sure a lot of them are like, please don't say that. But we have that there. That is our guide. That is our direction. We don't have to make it up. We don't have to spice it up. We just have to make it accessible to the public.
Amen.
So what I say to this is that the facts don't change. I mean, we can change whatever today. We think differently than we did maybe 20, 30 years ago or whatever, but the facts of history don't change at all. The example that I have from this is back when First Lady Michelle Obama talked about how she wakes up every morning. I think her quote was, "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." Yeah, there were other people involved in the building, but the point is that became controversial really because of, I guess, who said it and what she was talking about or whatever, but that's fact. And my answer to that really is that Betty Ford woke up in the same house. Pat Nixon woke up in that same house. Hillary Clinton woke up in that same house, the same place. It was the same place built by the same people. So what she was, I don't think it was really political as so much as it was a history lesson. That's the fact. These are who these people were, and this is where they woke up, built by enslaved people, built by other people involved, but that was just historic fact, period.
Yeah, I agree with Bryan. I agree with Nicole. You know, I think my job is to use those primary sources as responsibly, as objectively as I can, to tell the story of the past and in a way that's engaging. And what I really hope, though, is I really hope that when people engage with that, be it a wayside or a museum exhibit or an interpretive program or whatever it is, that they are provoked to think about the modern world and their lives and the contemporary political landscape. You know, I think, in terms of being a public historian, I love working at Gettysburg. I love where I am, because I've worked at national parks where Americans didn't necessarily find them as, I'll use the word relevant. Gettysburg, though, the American Civil War, Civil War defenses of Washington, the themes that are at the core of these sites are really part of the same issues that we're dealing with as a society today. I mean, I heard John Hennessy, when he was at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania, one time talk about how you can go out to any news source you want, left-leaning, right-leaning, you can pick up any newspaper, and you can read through it, and you'll read about something related to race, you'll read about something related to citizenship, you'll read something about the role of the government in the lives of everyday people, and that's like baked into what we do at battlefield parks like Gettysburg and other Civil War sites. So I think that's a real benefit, that's an advantage of being at a place like this for a public historian, that there are these connections and thoughts that you hope visitors have that are provoked by a visit to your site. I do briefly, Ashley, want to jump back to your comment about how things changed in 2015 with Dylan Roof. I remember that very clearly, and I remember the response that the park got was not necessarily related to that exact incident, but the public response was related to what the Park Service did after that. And what that was is we had to go into every bookshop, every gift shop at a battlefield park site or any national park site, and we had to remove any standalone item with a Confederate flag on it. So the shot glass or the Confederate flag beach towel or you name it. John Koski's book on the Confederate battle flag, that could stay, but the Confederate flag onesie, which we had, yeah, had to go. The real question is, why did we have that stuff to begin with? But the public response to that, at least from a portion of the public, was, oh, you're removing the Confederate flag now. You're taking the Confederate flag from these battlefield spaces. That then translated into, they're not flying the Confederate battle flag at Gettysburg anymore. We never flown the Confederate battle flag at Gettysburg. But that was the reaction. That was the issue that we had to navigate as far as our public relations.
And the strange thing is, I remember that onesie was an adult size. Just saying.
Are you going to return it, or?
All right, now we're going. Now we're going.
Now we're warm.
Oh, man.
So that leads me to one kind of additional follow-up question here. With all of the political charge and emotional charge that came from 2015 and then just continued throughout, the 20-teens and up to the current moment, is there a possibility that perhaps all of the emotion that was packed into that maybe obscured some of the complexities of Confederate history? Kevin, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I think that's actually an understatement. I mean, you nailed it. I think it's extremely difficult to talk about Confederate history as history, especially in my line of work. When I first started blogging, again in 2005, I have a long, deep file of emails from people who are obviously not happy with my debunking of an example like the Black Confederate myth. So they tended to be from a sort of neo-Confederate perspective, right? You're not honoring the Confederacy. And what's interesting is that over the last few years, my email file and the attacks come from the opposite side. And they come from people who have zero patience now, and it's a substantial number from what I can tell, with any attempt to talk about the history of the Confederacy, because what you end up doing is running the risk of giving people the impression that you are, in trying to uncover history, honoring it in some way, that you're memorializing it. And so that makes trying to get at some of the complexity of Confederate soldiers, Confederate generals, the Confederate home front, you name it, extremely difficult. And so, yeah, I don't really know what the solution is. I think within the context of public history sites, the approach is, as we've already heard, to do really good history, right? To make sure that you have your sources in order, to make sure that you are interpreting X based on the latest scholarship. But in my world, a social media / online world, that's a very difficult kind of thing to get at, because people's patience these days is very limited. Although at the same time, it's kind of strange to say that, because at the same time, I actually think that people are very hungry for history of some of the most controversial subjects, including Confederate symbols like the Confederate flag. And so when I'm writing about it, man, I've got John Koski's book right next to me, and I'm going to quote that from as much as possible when I'm trying to talk about or write about this subject. But take another subject right now that's incredibly controversial, and that, of course, are Confederate monuments. And try to bring some complexity to that discussion. Try to say anything other than every Confederate monument was dedicated to intimidate African Americans. And you're going to get into a lot of trouble. Now, of course, many of those monuments were dedicated, and you can read the dedication addresses, and those messages were very, very explicit and directed specifically at certain people. But the history of Confederate monuments is incredibly complicated. Look at the first generation of monuments that are dedicated in cemeteries. The focus for those monuments was very, very different. And then, of course, we see a shift by the 1870s, and then, of course, by the turn of the century. But trying to sort of navigate this history is can be extremely frustrating. So I don't really have any
Has
answers
anybody else
here.
encountered that with people who think that to learn about Confederates is an endorsement of Confederates? Do you get that?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I like to try to think of it as it's important to learn Confederate history so that you can be a source of some kind of sensible fact.
Yeah.
Rather than just,
I always say, what good is Batman without the Joker?
then there's that too.
Well, I mean, the Union
Can we have that
victory-
discussion tomorrow? So, okay.
The Union victory is hollow if you don't know the enemy.
Well, yeah, but no, I mentioning about Confederate monuments, for one thing, I mean, remembering that many Confederates never came home and were never heard from again. So I guess with monuments, if it's the way to have some kind of closure, I know why they fought and everything, of course. But I did want to mention, since we talked a few times about 2015 and Dylan Roof, that my wife told me that she was, after that happened, and I remember when it happened, and it was a horrible thing, that she was listening to a morning radio show, on a rock radio station, and they asked the question on the morning show that the question was, how did we get from the murder of 9 people to them canceling the Dukes of Hazzard? Okay, but so I don't know what they discussed. They talked, I guess, for the next 5 or 10 minutes or whatever, and just kind of went around in maybe circles or whatever. But I thought about that, and I said, I wish I'd, I guess, been there or maybe called in, because I think I would have liked to ask the question that, how is it that here it is 150 years after that war ended, and that flag is still around? That's my question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, Kevin, what you're talking about, going back to your point about, there's this fatigue with, oh, you're talking about Confederates, oh, I don't want to listen, or, oh, those are the evil guys, that's all we need to know. It poses a serious intellectual problem about intellectual honesty and historical honesty. But it brings us up to what happened very recently in Louisiana with the burning of Nottoway Plantation. I read your Substack about that, which I thought had some very thoughtful points about it, that there were responses from both sides about the burning of this huge plantation, one of the largest slaveholding plantations in that region in Louisiana. And there were some people who were cheering that this huge historic plantation house had burned to the ground. It's no more. And then there were other people who were, of course, bemoaning the loss of it. And I think a lot of the people who were cheering for it, they came from 2 different kind of groups as far as I see. Nottoway Plantation was called a resort, so it was mostly used for weddings, for special events. Didn't really have much of an educational component to it, and it certainly didn't provide the kind of interpretation that you would expect about enslavement at one of the largest slaveholding plantations in the region. And I think people were understandably upset about that. And when it burned, they said, well, good riddance, to something that was just a money-making, racketeer job that just completely ignored the population of the enslaved. And then I think there were some other people who it was owned by former, white plantation owners. I'm glad to see it burned to the ground. It was a site of enslavement. But what is missed in between is it's also a testament to the world that the enslaved built architecturally, in terms of how they propped up the lifestyle of the family that lived there, in terms of how we understand the power dynamics between white and black residents at that plantation. And so there was a lot lost kind of in that impassionate, I completely support this and cheer for the burning of it, and the woe is me, life will never be the same again kind of reaction to it. And if we can somehow bring back the complexity there, maybe the in-person conversations, Chris, is what we need more of, but to try to understand where we're obscuring the past in our immediate emotional outpourings about things like that, I think it's a prime example.
I would say with Nottoway, it is extremely complex. On one hand, they were not talking about the men and women that built that place, but their fingerprints were everywhere. The mantles that people loved so much, craftsmen enslaved, the bricks enslaved. For some families, that was as far back as a root that they could find. That's gone. The issue was there was no intention on actually interpreting that and at least honoring and recognizing why that place still stands or still stood. There's a reason why people love going to these plantation sites for the architecture, for the gardens, but they never stop to really think, how is this even possible that this piece of wood and some brick is still standing 300 years later? Who could have done this? What magic here exists that has me oohing and ahhing over a mantle that if I tried to put it in my house would be termite ridden? And we lost a moment to have real significant conversations of the impact and the legacy of Black folks on this country, on the buildings that we cherish, on the landscapes that we love. And for some families who somebody 2 generations from now is going to figure out, my family was enslaved at this place, I would like to go see where they lived, where I came from, where somebody survived long enough to make somebody who made me. That is gone. That doesn't exist anymore. And for a lot of Black folks, unfortunately, sometimes our only tie to where we came from exists on those sites. So it is really hard when people say burn them all down, but that's our only place of, my family started here, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to. Versus, this is extremely painful, and being in these spaces is suffocating, and I don't care how beautiful Pete's landscaping was. I don't care that Bob carved this piece of wood. I don't care that this could be Cujo's fingerprint. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. And so when you see kind of that teetering of how do we balance those 2 feelings and those extremes versus, oh, this is beautiful, I'm gonna make some money off of it, we're gonna have mint juleps and hoop skirts, and we're gonna just make this just beautiful and just, we're gonna ignore the fact that this is how it got here. Those are very real complexities that as public historians who especially interpret sites like Nottoway have to contend with. Because as a Black person, I get asked all the time, how in the world, why, for what? But I also realize that those places hold so much more than the terror. They hold some of our collective DNA of who we are and where we come from. And those stories are more important, I think, when we realize how little we have and how easily it could be lost.
Thank you, Nicole. Did you have something to add, Kevin?
Yeah, just real fast. I thought the reaction, the responses was just fascinating. I wrote a number of posts on my newsletter about it. And I think just building on what Nicole has just said, which I agree with entirely, I think the response from the public, at least for people who were cheering, would have been very different if it wasn't Nottoway that burned down, but a place like Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. Because the difference between Nottoway and Whitney is that Whitney's a place where the lives of the enslaved is centered, right? And so they're doing the hard work of telling these stories, talking about the hard history, the difficult questions that so many of us are still not willing to come to terms with and understand. Nottoway, as Nicole rightly pointed out, and as Ashley pointed out, is a resort. It's a place to have fun. And so I think that was really what was, that's what really caused the response of people cheering. And who can blame them?
So I know a number of the photographs I saw of that, it appeared to me that those people who were cheering the destruction of that place were local people. They lived there. Yeah. And so, I want to say I can understand how, if you live in that community, and that's that site, and you see how it's being used day in and day out, I think I can appreciate where that emotion comes from. From a National Park Service perspective, if we were to look at it like any other historic resource or structure in the park or anywhere else, I mean, you hate to lose something like that. That's a non-renewable resource right there. It's not coming back, ever. It's gone. And ownership is ephemeral and usage is ephemeral. It can change over time. And so when the house is gone, you forever lose any potential it's going to have to change the narrative. For example, the backside of Little Round Top for a long, long time was a carnival park. There were prostitution rings happening in the back of Little Round Top. Yeah.
So many questions.
Not anymore, obviously, but but I think just at least I don't think. But it just goes to show how sites can change. Sites sometimes for the better, sometimes not for the better. For example, a site of enormous trauma and tragedy, a place called Camp Letterman, where for 4 months following the Battle of Gettysburg, you had the largest field hospital associated with this battle. I mean, that's gone. It existed in part a few months ago. It's gone today. When you lose something, you lose it forever.
Thanks. I'll just say Matt Callery has been known to show up in his Confederate flag onesie at those areas of prostitution.
Yeah, that is all a joke. Every element of that story is a joke.
At this time, I would like to open the floor to you all because I'm sure that there are many questions out there, and we do want to have. Oh boy!
Jesus.
Okay.
Look at the move.
What is happening?
One at a time, no pushing.
No, they're going to the
All right. Looks like you got to the mic first.
Yeah, I am just finished my first year of teaching 8th grade U.S. history. So just graduated from college last year, and I have the blessing of teaching in a school district that's extremely culturally and politically diverse, left and right. And like Matt, you said, you know, teachers are boring, right? In the way, I know, like you, but like how you teach history is important, right? And I refuse to teach history through names and dates, right? I go through perspectives, and I really hit on primary sources. And that really helps me cover my basis in terms of like, if there's a parent complaint, right, I'm able to say, I didn't say this, Alexander Stevens said this, right?
Yes.
And like, I guess where I want to ask this question is, my experience in education so far has been, especially with history, has been very negative because of the scrutiny history teachers come under for teaching hard history, right? Real history. And I was wondering if you guys had any advice for somebody like me or educators in general of how to approach teaching hard history, meanwhile not becoming biased towards a particular side, but also doing important things and getting that information to kids so that they can have a real learning experience that's not just names, dates, and events.
Ooh, can I was going to say, can I? First, you're already doing some of that work by your comment, like primary sourcing it. Forever in a day, document, whatever you have that allows the student to actually see this moment in that time, that's what you need to be doing. That is going to save you. Because you can argue with your mama, but you cannot argue with these facts, right? And so that is what's going to be key. Here's the thing, though. You're going to teach these students amazing methodologies on how to be critical thinkers and how to analyze and how to dig deep. Be ready, though, when they take that and the answer that they give you is not necessarily the one that you would want them to come up with. Know that you didn't fail them. In fact, you might have done your job a little too good. Because what you want them to do at the end of the day is take that information and come to their own conclusion.
Yes.
Then you put your hands up and you say, listen, I don't know if I would have chose that, but you showed me how you got here, and that's all I can ask. Stick with the documents, stick with the facts, and let them learn how to analyze, read, comprehend for themselves, so that when they do study these events, these places, these people, these moments, that's what they're going to really dive into is how did they get to that point? What was the aftermath of that point? And what do I think about that?
Thank you.
I second that because, I'm sorry, Kevin, but real quick, I take the same approach with the show. Even though you're teaching kids and my audience is vastly older than I am. No, just kidding. But they're older. Sorry, you're not, Mike, I'm sorry. But you have to give them the credit to be able to think for themselves. They're not stupid. And even though you're molding minds, the best way to do that is to let them make up their own mind and present the evidence and let them figure it out. And so I totally love that answer. Thank you.
I would just say, since you're just starting out, protect yourself. And what I mean by that is know the culture of your school and the broader community. And this is a message for, I know there are any number of teachers, educators in the audience here. if you're teaching what you describe or refer to as hard history, if you think it might help for your department chair to be aware of what you're doing, your principal, anyone else, do that, right? Because you can't predict, as Nicole alluded to, what your students are going to take from a lesson and what those discussions at home will sound like and how parents will interpret them. And I'm saying this as someone who works with teachers through professional development workshops all year round. And so I've heard all the nightmare stories. And so, take precautions. Obviously, I'm not trying to put, fear in you at this point in your career, but I think it is important because we are in this climate. And the last thing I would say is just to build on what we've already talked about, do good history. Right? I mean, make sure that your lessons are built on reliable, not just primary sources, but in terms of your interpretation of these events, not just your textbook perhaps, but scholarship to whatever extent possible. See yourself as an expert, right? I think it's really important for historians to at least see themselves as experts, even if we as a country don't respect them, right? And that's unfortunate. That not only do we not respect teachers, man, we live in a country that demonizes history teachers right now.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little emotional.
Eric, we'll go to you.
I'll walk you to your car.
So first of all, Matt, I'm not that much older than you, but
Right.
so and what I want to start off by just saying thank you all. I mean, my own journey into really getting into history has been the last 3 to 5 years. And I could tell you that my positions have changed drastically from listening to podcasts, visiting parks and museums, Kevin reading your book, things like that. So, and the only way you can't see the truth is if you insist on having your eyes closed. So thank you guys for what you do with that, and what you do for all of us. My question is, you guys talked several times about facts. The facts are the facts. But what do we do when the facts are not the facts? We live in a world now, while it probably doesn't hit us so much in Civil War, Kevin, I'm surprised you haven't got an AI image of a division of Confederate soldiers yet. Yeah. You may have. But what do we do in a world where AI is becoming the next step beyond social media of truly, they're not facts anymore because they're falsified things that look like the stuff that we were taught to believe and trust as a fact?
So I think I've just decided that I'm just not going to be that scared of AI. I mean, maybe I'm naive, but first of all, before what we call AI, or A1 if you're make that mistake.
Maybe.
So anyway.
Love the spice.
But yeah, it's good spice.
Yeah.
But anyway, good sauce. No, there's always been something, some kind of, special effect or whatever it is that have fooled people. It might be a little harder because I'm sure it's going to get better, but I think for one thing, definitely find those places. Hold on to those primary sources. Find those places that have these, because that's the thing with history. I mean, this is not going to change. A photograph of some time from the Civil War, whatever, it's not going to change. You may see somebody mess with it and it'll be online, but you'll know that, well, that's not the real thing because this is the real thing. And when those things are in repositories like the Library of Congress or the National Archives, that's also another thing. So like I said, for me, I'm just not going to let it be a boogeyman for me. Not saying anybody is, but I'm just saying I just don't think I'm going to be that afraid of it.
It terrifies me. No, it doesn't. Actually, it's useful. As like Bryan says, I think we're always going to be able to tell AI because there's just something about it. I know it's in its infancy, but there's something about it just doesn't sit right. Yeah. And but it's a useful tool for certain things. I will give you a quick example. When I write like show notes or something, and I'm like a one-man show, so I don't have an editor, I don't have all these, so I got to do everything, and I have a stupidly insane release schedule. And so when I edit a show and post it to go out, now I have to write notes, the description, And my brain is just fried at that point. And so I found that I could go into Grammarly. They have an AI thing there. Or I call it Al, because I always mistake it for Al. They should use a different font so that the I has a cross going over the top. But anyway, thank you. You're great. So, but no, so I would go in there, I would say, I'm doing a YouTube show about whatever, please write a description for that, include this, that, and the other thing, and then I can go in there and I've got something to work with, and then I go in and I change it so that it sounds like it's more me. But it's helpful in that regard. Otherwise, I would have very paltry show notes, and they're not that great to begin with anyway, but so it's helpful, but you got to be careful because it's I don't know, that's a whole other thing on art.
Yeah, I don't know that the facts have ever been the facts. Going all the way back to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Joshua Chamberlain fought on Little Round Top. In his lifetime, he wrote 7 or 8 different accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg. Not one of them agrees with another on various aspects of that battle. Or
He
you could
invented
have
AI.
He didn't even have AI, right?
No, he invented it.
He invented it?
Civil War AI.
Or you could have another issue or facet of the past, Battle of Gettysburg, whatever, where you have 2 diametrically opposing perspectives and memories on one specific event that don't line up. So I think this is just another element of being a historian, is trying to navigate things like AI or these alternate facts or whatever you want to call them.
I just want to jump in here and say I'm not ashamed or afraid to admit that I hate AI with every fiber of my being, and I will tell everybody I meet that I hate AI, not just because of the fact issue. I'm sure that other fields have some use for it, but to me, one of the big issues, it erodes critical thinking. Yep. Because you can literally type a question. Students over there, put your hands over your ears. You can literally type in a question that your professor gives you and say, cite these sources and answer this question, and it will write you a paper. Yeah. And I've seen it done, and I've had to deal with that personally, and that is something that students from a young age, from middle school, are getting entirely too reliant upon. They don't think for themselves, and in this world, you need to learn to think for yourself. So I'm very much against it, mostly for the critical thinking aspect, and I truly kind of fear for our profession as a result of it.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to be a little more complicated in my question. I'm not going to ask 6 questions, so don't worry about that. I think my question here is that history is sometimes integral in how we see ourselves and how we identify. And each one of us here has a different history, and each one of us has a different interpretation of history and how that defines who we are. So my question is, as public historians, and yes, Matt, I'm including you in this, is that how do you deal with so many different varying identities, and how do you speak to those through history?
Our own personal varying identities, or just the identities of people in general?
Both.
Okay, I'm a Southerner by birth, but I grew up in Honolulu, right? So I have very, very different views on racism. I know it exists, I've experienced it. But growing up, I experienced it in a very different way than when I came to college and was like, oh, y'all are still on that? Wow. So I navigate from that space of where fundamentally, those founding years for me happened. But I also realize I'm a Black woman who does this work, who is really an interpreter of enslavement, but who is also a person who leads organizations, sits on boards, and has the capacity to think about all of these complexities together, say, that makes sense to me, but here's why I'm gonna tell you this isn't how we should do these things. You have to be comfortable with being able to bounce back and forth through those identities, because without that, you are going to be confused. And if we are confused as public historians on who we are, where we come from, what we do, how we do things, we are no good to the public that we are supposed to be teaching, reaching, and inspiring. So for me, it is understanding how people see me, how I come across to people, Sometimes I got to code switch. During this, I haven't done that much because you know what? I'm going to be 100% me in this moment because this is what I do. But I realize in other spaces, I have to be a little bit more polished because somebody will not respect the words coming out of my mouth unless they come from somebody who does not look like me. And so for me, it's taking all of that, understanding all of that that's happening at one time, and then looking at who am I talking to, what am I talking about, how am I doing my work, and navigating that. It's a lot of effort sometimes, but honestly, if you're passionate about the work and you know that you have a message that you have to get across, I play into each identity as I need to, because I know that's going to resonate with somebody in some way, in a different way than if I came through and talked to some school kids about A, B, and C versus if I'm talking to adults or multi-million-dollar funders. And so I think it's understanding how we have to be comfortable navigating those identities in the spaces we inhabit, or else we cannot be good at what we do, and therefore we cannot be good for our public. Sorry.
Well said.
Anybody else have? Okay.
All right, so my question
Next
is
question.
Concerning how we feel as a nation emotionally about World War II, which is relatively recent, and the Civil War, which is not. And you can watch the History Channel, and there's a whole series on Hitler and whatever, and we view Hitler as evil and Himmler and Goebbels, and maybe not Rommel or Dönitz because they're the military people. Is there something where our evil was 250 years that we resolved in a 4-year war? Or because in World War II, the evil was 4 years of war and whatever, 8, 9, 10 years of evil leading up to it. So Germany was an evil, and then Hitler came into power. So it was a briefer period, and the war was the evil. In the Civil War, the war cured the evil. Is that why we're not as passionate about World War II like we are about the Civil War, where you get Dylan Roof running around showing the Confederate flag?
That was a good question.
Did it? Not sure what the question was.
Well, I will say this. I will say this. I want to be careful because this is being filmed, so I'm going to deflect some of this. So I think the idea that the Civil War is more popular in American society right now than World War II I think that's incorrect. I think actually World War II is far more popular amongst the average American right now than the Civil War. I actually think in the Civil War we're on somewhat of a decline. I think there are a variety of factors behind that. One, we're kind of seeing the passing of the World War II generation right now, but you can still meet them. So there's that. I think popular culture has gravitated away from the American Civil War to World War II. So you got Saving Private Ryan, the Band of Brothers, that kind of thing. I think you see younger people, and we didn't get to talk about living history. I think you see younger people now moving towards World War II instead of Civil War. And I think that I think it's easier for maybe Americans to look at themselves as the good guy in World War II, whereas the Civil War perhaps is a bit more complicated now.
Yeah.
I just want to say this one thing, that I'm always try to be careful with balance sheets on these things. I don't think that this period of history or that period of history are necessarily equal. So I don't know that trying to look at one thing and compare it to another, I'm not sure what you'll get out of that. That's just my thought.
Also, I'm not sure if either of those wars cured evil, but they might have broken the power structure that evil lived in. But I don't think the evil has ever gone away. So, I think we like to think it has, but it hasn't.
Yeah, I think going off of what you were saying about, Chris, about it's easier for Americans to see ourselves as the good guy. I think it's always easier when there's a foreign power that we fight in a war to kind of more or less unite. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case when you're talking about Vietnam or something like that. But with World War II, you're talking about totally external powers that creates kind of that internal sense of unity and nationalism, which maybe, I don't know, 50 years from now, we're going to see kind of the passionate debates that we're having about the Civil War right now. Who knows? It might be a distance thing as well in terms of chronology. But I think it is always easier when it's America versus someone else for more people to kind of jump on board. We have time for one more question.
Just very quickly, and we really want to thank the National Park Service people for educating us about our history. But I want to ask this question to Kevin, because on Monday from 4 p.m. until 6:30, there will be a rally at the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. And I know, Kevin, you started this. Why did you do this?
Well, thanks for the question. When I started, my interest in the Civil War, started back in the late 90s. And right from the beginning, like many of you, I visited National Park Service sites. And that's where I learned my Civil War history. And so for me, it's the historians, the rangers, they're the ones who have given me my education. I owe so much to the National Park Service. I've learned enough that I can now I used to bring my students, I can now bring other students that I work with throughout the year. I can bring teachers to these places, and I can share with them what I've learned. And so I couldn't imagine, with everything that's happened, coming down to Gettysburg, and not finding some way to say thank you and just to say that we support you. And so, yeah, that's why I'm doing it. And that's it. Thank you.
And if you can't make it there at 4 p.m., we'll be there till 6:30, so come on in after your classes.
All right, thank you all. And we do have some of our panelists do have books that are available in the book sale area back here. And the panelists will all be back there for a few more minutes as well before dinner. If you do have questions, I know we have more questions from the audience. I'm sure they'll be happy to hang out and talk with you all for a bit. Thank you.